Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to have you today in this virtual webinar. And we have a great guest with us today, Miss Sharon Udasin. She's located in Colorado, and she's the writer of the book Poisoning the Well. Now, How Forever Chemicals Contaminated America. And this book is, I think, very important because it touches very important contamination throughout US and a worldwide contamination, of course. And for students, especially in environmental health or environmental science, environmental studies at different levels, undergrads, college level, graduate level, could be very interesting to follow this talk. And we'll see what Ms. Udasin has today for us. So I just give a brief introduction about PFAS, the center of this talk. There are groups of chemicals, and a very short introduction about Ms. Udasin. And then the whole floor will be hers to tell us about her book and what she found with those compounds and contamination in the US. So PFAS, or per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, there are a large family of human-made chemicals used since the mid 20th century in products like nonstick cookware, like Teflon, right? The brand name, famous brand name Teflon, stain and water resistant fabrics, firefighting foams, some food packagings, and many industrial processes. They often called forever chemicals because they're very persistent. There are strong carbon fluorine bands, and which makes them extremely persistent in environment and slow to break down. PFAS are now found in air, soil, water, wildlife, and human blood across the globe. And in environmental science, they matter because they move easily through water and can contaminate drinking water supplies, surface water, ground water for decades or longer. Cleaning them up is technically challenging and very costly. From an environmental health perspective, PFAS are important because some of them have been linked to serious health concern like certain cancers, immune system effects, high cholesterol, thyroid disruption, pregnancy complications, and developmental effects in children based on epidemiological and toxicological studies. Regulatory agencies and researchers are actively working to understand their risk, set safe exposure limits, and develop better monitoring and remediation strategies. That was just a little bit about PFAS. So hopefully that brief helps you to follow Ms. Udasin talk better. And a little bit about Ms. Sharon Udasin. Sharon is a Colorado-based environmental journalist and the author of Poisoning the Well, How Forever Chemicals Contaminated America. She was a TED Scripps Fellow in Environmental Journalism at the University of Colorado Boulder in 2019-2020 and received a SIL Environmental Journalism Award in 2023. A graduate of both the University of Pennsylvania and Columbia Journalism School, she has reported for numerous publications over the past 2 decades, most recently for The Hill. So I thank you. I have a special thanks to Ms. Udasin and invite her to begin her talk. Thank you very much for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you for having me, and that was a really generous introduction. So I'll just dive right in. Um, when we head to the grocery store, treat ourselves to new clothes, or refill our water bottles, most of us aren't aware of every ingredient we're about to possibly put into our bodies. Instead, we're putting our trust in companies and governments to keep us safe in sort of an unwritten pact between supplier and consumer. But today we're going to take a look at some cases in which that trust has been broken, focusing on communities that have weathered some of the most tragic effects of what has now become a global contamination crisis. So we'll start with a brief visit to Cortland, Alabama, to encounter one of these places. There is Cortland. Now, here's the historic Cortland Town Square. It's very picturesque. I had the privilege of getting to visit this area in March 2023. And what I saw there was a historic southern town surrounded by sprawling greenery. It's a place that's home to one of the South's first railroads, and it has nearly 200 years of architecture, ranging from the Victorian era to veranda-wrapped white picket fence cottages. But what I also saw there was a huge amount of death and devastation. Let's now hear from Brenda Hampton, who's an activist who took me on a ride through Portland in March 2023. And in this picture, I'm sitting in the passenger seat, and she was saying the following at approximately this time. I'll turn on the subtitles. There we go.
The father and the mother, the father and the son had died there. The next house, the mother died at. The next house coming down the street, husband and wife died. The next house was husband and wife. The next house was a female that died. Young girl died here in this house here. As I serviced this house, the husband died in there. He had renal failure. The wife is still alive in there. The lady that lived in there, she's dead.
Now, my co-author and I each had this tour separately with Brenda, and we came to know this tour as Brenda's death tour, is what we called it. Now, the thing about Brenda is she's just a regular person who in 2015 had undergone a routine checkup as part of her managerial transfer for McDonald's from Boston to Tennessee. She was shocked to find, however, that she was in renal failure, and her doctor told her at the physical that she had been exposed to something toxic. And what she said to me was what I was working with, it was nothing toxic. It was hamburgers and French fries. But she was so startled about these almost random findings that she decided to move back to her hometown, Cortland, Alabama, instead of making that transfer to Tennessee because she wanted to be with her daughters and other family members. And just to take a look at this map here, you'll see Cortland and North Cortland. Those are basically the twin Cortlands. Each one has just a few hundred residents apiece. And Brenda is a very curious person, and she quickly observed how sick people were in both of the Cortlands. She found 54 cases of cancer and 14 of kidney failure in 2 streets alone. Now, Cortland residents eventually found out that their water was contaminated by compounds known as PFAS, which were explained to you earlier. But Brenda self-funded efforts to distribute supplies and drive neighbors to medical appointments. However, she has hardly been spared. In addition to that kidney failure I mentioned before, Brenda suffered 2 heart attacks and a stroke since then. And I'll emphasize here that all she and her neighbors were doing were trusting what comes out of the tap. It's something that you and I do every single day. Now, you just heard what are PFAS. I can run through this pretty quickly because this is pretty similar to what was mentioned before. But try to say this 3 times fast per and polyfluoral alkyl substances. I guess I can at this point. But it's an acronym for now about 15,000 synthetic organofluorines. And the number is interesting because if you ask scientists about 3 years ago, they'd say 7,000, 8,000, and now it's up to 15,000. I wouldn't be surprised if in a few years it's 20,000 because there's more and more of these created for different purposes, like pretty much daily. And as the professor said earlier, they're in many household items such as waterproof fabrics, nonstick pans, cosmetics, certain firefighting foams, and their water and stain resistant properties have made them really useful, even critical at times. They're in medical devices like heart valves, first responder gear, and semiconductors. And all of those properties really do sound great. They sound convenient. But what's the problem is that PFAS don't break down in the environment virtually at all. And in the human body, they linger there by binding to proteins in the blood. And that's of at least 97% of Americans, according to the CDC. They're linked to so many issues, more and more every day. But some common ones are cancers and kidney, thyroid, heart, reproductive, and immunological issues. And as I saw in Cortland, which is really deeply detailed in the book, and I will get into a little bit later, downstream from massive industrial discharges, the effects of these compounds can be dire. And with such risky effects, you might think that regulators were quick to step in, but the EPA took decades to regulate just a few PFAS. They're forever and they're everywhere, but they weren't always. And before we dive into the birth of Forever Chemicals, I just wanted to show you a brief outline as to what to expect today. And here that is. So, as I just said, PFAS are forever and everywhere, but they weren't always. And in fact, their birth was accidental. So, this happened when a postdoctoral scholar named Roy Plunkett was working on replacements for hazardous refrigerants at a New Jersey DuPont lab in 1938. That lab was called Deepwater. So for Roy, very simplistically, this meant storing cold cylinders of tetrafluoroethylene, TFE gas, and he assumed that that gas would remain a gas. But upon opening the cylinders, he found a mysterious white powder instead. What he ultimately learned was that the TFE had undergone polymerization, in which a carbon-carbon double bond in a TFE breaks apart and attacks others. The mysterious powder that formed as a result was heat resistant and most things didn't stick to it. Now, DuPont really saw the value in this and decided to trademark the material as poly-TFE, PTFE, or Teflon in 1944. Now, Teflon quickly appealed to the US military. It was resistant to heat and corrosion, and it didn't interact with other chemicals. So, one of its first uses was to contain highly reactive materials like uranium in the making of the atom bomb. And Teflon only reached consumers thanks to an inventor across the world in France. So, an inventor named Marc Gregoire started just randomly coating his own pans with Teflon in his house and saw how useful that was and launched the company Tefal in Rumilly, a village in France, in 1956. Tefal then began exporting its products to the US in 1961, but those pans were really made popular by a photo of Jackie Kennedy purchasing a pan. Now, just to take us back to this era a bit, the 1960s, let's watch a very short clip of a TV commercial from the time.
Ladies, no more scraping, no more grinding, no more pounding, no more scouring, no more problems, no more mess with new Slip Away. You just spray, bake, and slip away. Yes, here in this handy spray can is new Slip Away, the revolutionary new non-stick coating for pots, pans, ovens, and grills. And Slip Away contains the magic of DuPont Teflon. Just spray the surface of your cooking utensils, bake in the oven for 30 minutes, and your Slip Away non-stick surface will literally last for months.
Ladies. So not everything was really as shiny as these pans might make it seem like, because really behind the scenes, there was a lot of toxicological research happening already at the companies at the same time. Now, I'll give you some examples. Again, there's many more in the book, but here are a few. In the 1950s, researchers inside and outside of DuPont found that some people exposed to heated Teflon developed flu-like effects. This was called polymer fume fever at the time. 1959, an FDA official wrote that Teflon may be, quote, unstable under cooking temperatures and some decomposition products are quite toxic. And yet, that same FDA went on to approve Teflon-coated cookware. In 1961, a DuPont toxicologist warned that some PFAS could cause liver enlargement in rats. In 1978, 3M, another company that was producing PFAS, found the substances in its employees and saw that fluorine levels were proportional to the length of time they worked there and persisted in some people for 15 to 20 years after. And then in 1981, 3M found something so problematic about one type of PFAS, PFOA, that it decided it was time to alert the EPA. And that was a link to birth defects in rats. Basically, what they had seen was that fetuses of rats that had consumed PFOA were developing eye deformities. But their alert also emphasized that no human health problems have been observed. So, one of the places where 3M and other industries set up shop was in northern Alabama, near the city of Decatur, and upstream from Brenda's community in Cortland. So, you see the lay of the land here. We have 3M. Opened its doors in 1961. It's right next to Decatur, which was a booming city at one point, not so much anymore. And then Cortland, where Brenda is from, is just downstream, even though it looks like the river's going up, but that's really downstream. So by 1976, 3M in Decatur found one other notorious type of PFAS, that is PFOS, in a Decatur worker's blood, and then again in the blood of several employees in 1979. By the 90s, scientists at the company were citing interest in possible health risks to Decatur workers regarding liver and bladder cancers, as well as endocrine and reproductive disorders. The effects were also stretching beyond the factory bounds. In 1979, PFAS were identified in fish caught in the river around the Wheeler Dam and water utilities downstream from the plant. Now, this is a photo I took of the Wheeler Dam in 2023. This is a huge dam along the Tennessee River. And another interesting thing I saw was that despite like an occasional do not fish sign here and there, not hugely visible, um, people were just out there fishing and feeding those fish to their families. And these are incredibly contaminated waters to this day. Now, in 2007 to 2010, the federal government finally started stepping in this region with their regional office, and the EPA there began testing the water after one company reported that it had, quote, unknowingly discharged large amounts of PFAS into the Tennessee River. 2014, the CDC's ATSDR started taking community blood samples, and those showed that PFOA and PFOS levels were 2 to 4 times higher than US averages among those individuals. Now, many plants still line the Tennessee River today, and they're allowed to dump, according to Alabama law, even though the EPA deems the area impaired with PFOS and with agricultural materials. Companies have at times violated their legal bounds, doing things like underreporting PFAS releases and breaching contracts. But these plants are a pillar in the Decatur region and they are a major employer. A former city council president, Paige Beebe, really put it very well. She said, "Look at Decatur's history. Anything and everything we have. If it's to the hospital benefit or anybody, you look on the program. Who is the platinum giver? 3M." But Brenda also makes an interesting point that because of the lack of regulation, it's kind of still a free-for-all there. And what Brenda Hampton said was they are still taking advantage of Alabama. Nobody goes by any rules. Nobody questions anything. Except, of course, Brenda. And Brenda herself was able to recruit a small cohort of fellow activists as well as scientists to her side. They've pushed through lawsuits, they've tested water, they've exposed injustices in the media. But in doing so, Brenda has made herself an enemy of locals who rely on industry. She said she was shot at, she had 2 cars destroyed, and she found that someone broke into her truck and left a cut-up Chucky doll. But her efforts have helped secure a settlement between 3M and her water utility. And in 2019, 3M settled for $35 million, doling out small checks to affected residents, but even more importantly, enabled the utility to build a reverse osmosis treatment plant. So Brenda and her neighbors now have PFAS-free water flowing through their taps. And this was just the first of multiple settlements between 3M and Decatur area residents. And the rest are also all really highlighted as well in the book. And if you like to learn about municipal corruption in southern small towns, there's a hefty dose of that there as well. So the experiences of Cortland and Decatur showed us the lasting impacts of PFAS producers on adjacent communities, but industry is not alone. The military has also been part of this journey since day one. And let's go to Colorado to see an example. So this is El Paso County, Colorado, about 2 hours south of where I am sitting right now in Boulder. The city, Colorado Springs, and its El Paso County suburbs are really surrounded not only by natural wonders that you see here, like the Garden of the Gods, these beautiful, massive red rock formations, but these areas are also home to several military installations. The big ones are Peterson Space Force Base, U.S. Air Force Academy, and U.S. Army's Fort Carson. There are a few other smaller ones, but those are the big ones. About 45,000 military personnel, 15,000 federal workers, and 90,000 veterans reside there. And just so you understand a bit the lay of the land here, so Peterson is in yellow, Fort Carson is in green, and the area of focus in terms of contamination is the white area here. Stratmore, which is a neighborhood of Colorado Springs, which was not on the municipal water system for a long time, and Security and Widefield are suburbs of Colorado Springs. Now, although, as we learned before, PFAS had early roots in World War II, in the atom bomb, the military's usage of the substances really took off in the 1960s. And that was because the Navy worked with 3M to develop AFFF, a foam that was capable of suppressing jet fuel-based fires, really catastrophic fires. By 1979, AFFF was present at more than 90 U.S. civilian airports, and hundreds of military sites used the foam in emergencies and in training drills. But just like industry, the military scientists were doing a lot of research behind the scenes, and military reports show that the Department of Defense was looking into AFFF's toxicity for decades. Here are some examples. 1971, one military report cited a threat to fish, called AFFF a serious pollutant that didn't break down. 1985, a report conducted at Peterson Space Force Base labeled AFFF as hazardous. More recently, in 2016, the Army Corps of Engineers found PFAS in samples taken at Peterson, soil samples, and cited potential non-carcinogenic risks to human health and the environment, as well as the migration of PFAS to downstream wells. Now, one interesting thing is that Fort Carson started using water for training purposes in 1993. They listened to some of their own advice and replaced AFFF entirely in 2018. But just 10 minutes up the road, Peterson continued to use the foam. They took much longer, and it's really difficult to get a specific reason as to why, but some theories I've heard are just that the Air Force has more planes, and jet fuel is very flammable at high temperatures. But the Federal Aviation Administration also required its firefighters to test and train with AFFF. And in many cases, when it wasn't properly contained, that flowed into the environment until they stopped using it for that purpose in 2019. The Department of Defense eventually instituted a military-wide ban on AFFF for use in training and also pledged to cease its use entirely by 2024. From what I've heard, that has largely occurred, and there has been a suitable replacement put on most bases. But again, it's hard to get a definitive response as to whether it has 100% occurred. But some good news, in 2021, the Air Force Civil Engineering Unit at Peterson actually decided to launch PFAS removal pilot programs on base. So basically, they turned the base into, or parts of the base, into kind of a field laboratory, and professors from local universities have been able to bring their teams down there and really use the site as a place where they could study PFAS breakdown, PFAS removal. So that was great to see. But as of 2023, the Air Force had spent a total of $103 million on PFAS response at Peterson alone. And there are more than 500 bases at this point that have been deemed in need of remediation. So if it's $103 million spent on one base alone, just imagine how much of our tax dollars are going towards fixing this problem of our own creation. And here's a photo I took when I was on base in May 2023. And despite the fence, I think you can see back here that there's a charred airplane. And this plane was an old airplane, and they would use it in training purposes. They would just set it on fire, and then the Air Force firefighting team would go and train with the AFFF foam to put it out, and then that would just leach right into the environment and head downstream. Now, I'd like you to meet another protagonist from the book. This is Mark Favors. He grew up next to these bases during the Cold War era, part of a tightly knit Black family in largely white Colorado Springs. And as Mark tells it, Cold War era patriotism really molded the city and the surrounding area into a libertarian stronghold in which small government ideology reigned supreme. And as he put it, politics were highly, highly, highly discouraged. Military service, on the other hand, was the bread and butter of this community. Today, Mark is an ICU nurse in New York City, but he himself is a veteran, as are many of his relatives, most of whom still live in that region. Now, Mark only randomly learned about PFAS in 2018 while watching TV with his mom when he was visiting her in Colorado Springs. But since 1991, he had been seeking answers for the untimely death of his grandmother, Arletha Bragg. Arletha is pictured here to the left. And again, she's paternal grandmother. And to the right there is his maternal aunt, Ivory Mitchell. And I emphasize the paternal and maternal because these two are not related, and they both died young of cancers and lived in the same region. So after Mark learned about PFAS, he started digging. And luckily, the Colorado Department of Health and Environment has a pretty robust database and already did at that point in 2018 of PFAS hotspots, PFAS samples. And he was able to find out that the PFAS levels near Arletha's house in Widefield were far above the EPA's health advisories at the time. And illness really has stricken this whole family. Mark's cousin, Princess, who appears in the mural here, she grew up in Stratmore Valley. That was one of the southern neighborhood of Colorado Springs that was not on municipal water. And she had lupus-related kidney damage and then bladder cancer. The lupus already started at age 16. And then her brother, Steve Patterson, also Mark's cousin, was able to give her a kidney. He was a match. But the cancer returned to her liver, kidney, spine, anus, and brain, and she ultimately died, which is about a decade ago now, which is why she just appears here on a mural. But Steve, who gave his sister a kidney, was not spared at all. He eventually developed both prostate and rectal cancers, and this was pretty young prostate cancer. And I'd like for you to hear just something from Steve. Again, this is Mark's cousin. He said something really poignant about how this family copes with um, all the death and cancer that has taken place, which is quite a lot, actually, at this point.
If I think that if we was to stop and dwell on all this stuff, it'd probably even be worse. But what can we do? So if you see we're happy, we hang together, we laugh, we have fun, even though we just lost a brother and just lost a cousin. But life goes on. I mean, we cry at the funeral, but sometimes we don't even cry because I don't think we have any more tears left because it's just been so many deaths. You know, it's just been too many.
So Mark estimates that more than 2 dozen relatives at this point have suffered from serious illnesses that he attributes to PFAS releases from these bases. And at least 5 family members have suffered from kidney-related diseases. And once again, I'll say that these like 25 or so family members, they're not all related to each other. They're step-in-laws, cousins. They're not necessarily from a genetic root. But Mark has really been inspired to take the fight on this issue to Capitol Hill, and really starting with November 2019 at a House hearing, he began testifying about his family and urged Congress to launch an investigation into the PFAS issue. At the time, he spoke alongside Mark Ruffalo, who portrayed lawyer Rob Lott's fight against DuPont in West Virginia in the film Dark Waters. Now, they were making progress at the time, really trying to convince the lawmakers of the need for an investigation and had some bipartisan support. For example, Representative James Comer, a Republican from Kentucky, said he opposed sweeping actions that could cause economic harm, but he supported compensating families poisoned intentionally by corporate America. So that was a Republican voice, and Democrats also made similar comments, but notice the date in there. That was November 2019, and any of that was very quickly derailed by a global pandemic. But Mark hasn't stopped. He has continued to testify since, most recently, I think about 4 or 5 months ago, and he keeps pushing for this same topic and is regularly called to speak about it in Congress. And he says his goals are to find out what really happened and hold people accountable if there was something nefarious, as the documents imply. Now, one reason Mark wants to investigate this in Congress is because doing so is difficult in court. That's because of the lack of legal recourse. And one problem is something called the statute of limitations, which varies from state to state and defines the amount of time people have to sue. I'll give you a couple examples. So Colorado has a 2-year statute of limitations, but victims can wait to sue until finding a clear cause for injury. In Alabama, however, victims can only sue within 2 years of becoming ill. So virtually no one can sue on this issue in Alabama because by the time they find out that the cause was PFAS, it's already been much more time than that since they've become ill. Now, some of Mark's relatives have joined legal action called multi-district litigation. It's referred to as the MDL. And that has grouped thousands of claims versus AFFF producers before a federal judge in South Carolina. It's still ongoing. But notice that that says AFFF producers. It does not say the government. And that's because suing the government is really hard due to the federal government's discretionary function immunity shield, which holds up except in very extreme scenarios. But for Mark, there isn't a sum of money that could even make up for his family's losses. And what he says is, there's not enough money in the US Treasury for my grandmother. We've now seen how entire families have faced devastating consequences from PFAS pollution, whether from military or from industrial sources. But there's also been effects on animals and on businesses that depend on those animals for years and years. And I'd like us to go to South Central Maine. Specifically to, well, this is South Maine, but all three of those points on that map are in the book. But we're going to go to South Maine to Arundel to see some of the dramatic effects PFAS have taken on animals and on farms. As an example, and this is Fred Stone. He is a dedicated dairy farmer. His cows are members of his family. You can see the decorations from his house. And his license plate is Dairy O, and he is well versed in diseases of the cattle, revised edition from 1918, I believe. He is quite a quirky character, Fred. Now, Fred's grandfather purchased the 18th century farm that he still owns today in 1914, right after the grandfather came back from serving in World War I. And after it passed through a few generations, Fred and his wife Laura bought it from Fred's parents in 1977. But for Fred, there's a precise date of doom in his life, and that's November 3rd, 2016, when he received a letter from Kennebunk Water District saying that there was PFAS in his Wells aquifer, and the levels of PFAS were double the EPA's health advisories at the time. The Stones decided to test their milk. No one was telling them to do so. And they did this at the anger of their neighbors because they were now setting precedent for other farms in the region because their milk came back with sky-high PFAS levels. But Fred told me that he could not let this go on in good conscience without actually being aware of what his milk might contain. And Stone Ridge, the name of the farm, was immediately suspended from shipping milk. He and his wife installed a $23,000 filtration system in May 2017. And after about a year or so, the milk started coming back clean, because that's around how long it takes for cows to clear PFAS from their bodies. And things were going okay again. They were selling milk once again. But then suddenly the milk was testing for PFAS again. And what had happened? Fred had switched the cow's feed, and that feed apparently was from another local farm that had been contaminated by PFAS. And at that point, he just threw up his hands and he was like, I can't do this anymore. But he recalled to me how before Maine state officials even became familiar with the term PFAS, an environmental inspector came to his house and suggested that he exterminate his entire herd as if they had an infectious disease. Now you will get some of Fred's charm here to hear what he has to say about that.
And I said, fine, Tanya, I think it's a hell of an idea. I said, we'll go down to the compost site because we have a thing for, exterminating animals, and I said, and again, these cow families go way back to, 40, 50 years, and generations and generations and the lineage and what have you. So I said, I'll tell you what, Tanya, I said, I'll do that. We'll take them all down there. I'll put on my show whites, and I'll stand in front, and I'll take the first bullet, and then you can slaughter the rest of them. A week later, I get a letter from the state of Maine about suicide prevention.
He's not joking. So in June 2017, Maine's Department of Environmental Protection, that's where a lot of these inspectors that he refers to come from, finally reported that the contamination found on his farm came from the 1983 to 2004 spread of something called sludge. What is sludge? Semi-solids left over after sewage treatment. And much of Maine sludge comes from treatment lagoons at paper mills. The state has a huge number of paper mills, and some have used PFAS in their pulping processes. Secondary wastewater treatment that occurs on site generally removes solids, but not PFAS. And some of the PFAS sticks to the solids and some of it stays in the water. But who conducted the spreading of this sludge? Well, turns out it was none other than Fred Stone himself. At Maine's bidding, he had slathered his fields and other people's fields with what he thought was nutritious fertilizer. Essentially, utilities had been peddling sludge to farmers as a win-win. The utilities didn't need to pay for landfilling, and farmers got free fertilizer. And this was all backed by the state of Maine, because Maine was struggling with dump space shortage due to a 1989 ban on new private landfilling sites. During yet another inspection, Fred was equipped with choice words and decades-old documents that he has luckily kept in his garage. This one is particularly interesting because it's promising him in his permit from the Department of Environmental Protection in the 1980s that spreading sludge will not pollute any water of the state. And it's signed by the commissioner. And here's what he had to say about this.
And because I am a complete a-hole, I walked over into my filing cabinet and pulled out a permit from '86, and it is on Department of Environmental Protection's masthead. It states that this material will not contaminate any waters of the state of Maine. This material will not present a health hazard. There's a whole laundry list that goes through. And on the backside, it is signed by the commissioner at the time of DEP. And just because I'm really go for gold, I also included the letter from Kennebunk Water stating that the water in the aquifers at 146 and was contaminated. And game, set, and match. I'm positive that the poor girl from DEP did not know that those documents existed.
So there's that second letter that told him his water was contaminated. And I did, of course, ask the DEP like about this. And the spokesperson just said that the 1983 license was issued decades before DEP had standards in place for PFAS, which is true. Now, the thing about Fred is he's entirely an accidental activist. In fact, he will tell us all that he is not an activist. He is not an organic farmer. He is a traditional farmer, and he describes himself as a staunch anti-Trump Republican who joined local Democrat Henry Ingwerson to advance PFAS bills through the legislature in Maine. And he says he did so simply because he wanted everyone to be able to drink clean water and produce clean milk. And Maine has been really advanced in its PFAS legislation, despite having one of the worst contamination situations. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but some specific ones it was the first state in the nation to ban products with intentionally added PFAS, and there's a near full ban that's going to come in place by 2030. Many states have done at this point, eliminating PFAS-based firefighting foams. But another national first, and Maine remains one of the only states to do this, was banning PFAS-laden sludge application to farmlands. And the state also created a $60 million PFAS fund for buybacks of polluted farmland. Now, Fred was actually one of the people who helped create the PFAS fund, but he says he's not too keen on it due to his farm's history, his legacy. He doesn't know where the farm would go if it would be bought back. And yet, at the same time, the Stones have had to file for Chapter 12 bankruptcy on their house. They've needed food stamps, they've needed subsidized health care. And as Fred puts it, he says there's not a whole lot of lead in our pencils. But there has recently, and actually after the book was published, been a ray of hope. The Stones are partnering with a solar power company to put panels on their contaminated land. So that's some good news for Fred and Laura. Now, we've had a look at how local communities and states have been both created and coped with the threats posed by PFAS. Before concluding, I want to take a short look at the federal government, as well as a quick stop in California, and then end with some potential solutions. So, the book goes back to about George W. Bush era, but let's just start with Obama. During that era, PFAS was not a priority at all. Some research did occur, however. The EPA updated its 1976 toxics law. Chemicals would now need to be proven innocent to enter the market rather than guilty to be removed. In 2012, the EPA identified a new PFAS, Gen X, in North Carolina's Cape Fear River, and residents were becoming sick. But now there were some interesting things coming out about this because blood samples taken in that area didn't show Gen X. Instead, they showed three new types of PFAS. So there was this PFAS whack-a-mole really happening during this era where you'd seen like one PFAS knocked down and plenty of others would pop up in their stead. And at that same time, there was also a corporate whack-a-mole taking place, and that was at DuPont, where its PFAS businesses kept trading hands. They kept like spinning off into new companies, and it was very, very confusing. And when asked about this is what DuPont has to say about that. In 2019, DuPont de Nemours was established as a new multi-industrial specialty products company. DuPont de Nemours has never manufactured or sold PFOA, PFAS, Gen X, or firefighting foam. So I'm going to take that for what it's worth. After Obama, we get to Trump 1.0, and as I put it here, waiting for Godot with Trump 1.0. That administration like said it would assess the need for drinking water regulations, but never set them. A staffer described writing a rule to declare PFOA and PFOS as hazardous, and he said that was like waiting for Godot because it just sat there. New PFAS were approved via a loophole that allows loose review for chemicals made in small quantities, and another loophole was created to weaken toxic release reporting requirements, which the Biden EPA then later closed that second loophole. Now, a pivotal moment arrived in April 2024, and that was when the EPA, this is now the Biden EPA, finally set the country's first federal drinking water standards for PFAS, for 6 types of PFAS. And just so you have a frame of reference here, one PPT, you'll see these PPTs here, 1 part per trillion is equivalent to about a couple drops of water in 20 Olympic-sized pools. So this is very tiny quantities. Public systems would need to monitor for these 6 types of PFAS and fix all violations by 2029. And Biden's EPA also designated PFOA and PFAS as hazardous under the CERCLA Superfund cleanup law, making it easier to force polluters to clean up or pay for contamination. Unlike PFAS, however, not everything is forever. And that brings us to Trump 2.0. In May 2025, that EPA announced that it intends in this coming spring to rescind and reconsider limits on 4 of the 6 regulated PFAS. Only the regulations on PFOA and PFOS will be maintained, but compliance for them will be extended from 2029 to 2031. So 2 more years in which utilities can have those 2 carcinogens in their systems. There were proposals in the Fiscal Year Defense Act, a proposal to delay the AFFF phase out, a proposal to allow PFAS incineration, re-enable Pentagon purchases of PFAS products, and cut $200 million in PFAS cleanup funds. There have been reporting deadlines postponed, but there has been one surprising piece of good news. The Trump 2.0 EPA announced in September that it would maintain the Biden EPA's hazardous designations for PFOS and PFOA. Now, very quickly, where does California stand? So these are implementation dates rather than passage dates, to be clear here, of the following legislation. So 2022, a ban was instituted on PFAS-based firefighting foams. There was the same year an appropriation of, in 2 separate bills, $50 million and $30 million to address PFAS in drinking water. 2023, there was a $90 million appropriation, a similar type of appropriation. That same year also, a ban on PFAS in juvenile products occurred, a ban on PFAS in paper-based food packaging, a rule to disclose all ingredients in menstrual products, not just PFAS, but other chemicals as well. 2024, requirement for the disclosure of toxic chemicals in cookware. Products with PFAS couldn't be labeled as recyclable. 2025, there was a ban on textiles coated in PFAS, except for outdoor apparel, which has until 2028. A ban on cosmetics with PFAS. And then by 2028, the Occupational Safety and Health Standards Board has to consider possible phase out of PFAS in firefighter turnout gear. And by 2029, the Toxic Substances Control Department needs to adopt regulations for a PFAS ban in menstrual products. However, all that seems great, but very recently, October 13th, 2025, Governor Gavin Newsom vetoed a bill that would have banned intentionally added PFAS in nearly all products gradually. So you still have these individual bans on product categories, but you don't have this full-fledged ban like the state of Maine has. And there have been various theories as to why, but he mostly said that it was just too quick for the state of California and it could affect business. Getting slightly more local, we have San Bernardino County. And San Bernardino City has zero point 0.5 parts per trillion of PFHXS in its municipal water. So if you look at that, that's far below the 2024 EPA limit of 10 parts per trillion. And very small amounts of seven other types of PFAS. No violations, so just small amounts of PFAS, which I would say is not fantastic, but it could be worse. The Norton Air Force Base is a local source of PFAS. However, if you move beyond the city, in broader San Bernardino County, there's a lot of PFAS pollution hotspots. We have Fort Irwin, the Marine Corps Logistics Base Barstow, George Air Force Base, 29 Palms Strategic Expeditionary Landing Field, and the Naval Air Weapons Station China Lake, which straddles San Bernardino and Kern and Inyo, I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, counties. And some areas where residential areas that have, or recreational areas that have high levels of PFAS are Running Springs, Hesperia, Big Bear Lake, Big Bear City, Crestline Village, Victorville, Adelanto, Hellendale, Barstow, and Daggett. And all of this data is publicly available. So just to conclude, I want to emphasize that there are technologies for removing PFAS from water. They exist. Utilities are using them. People are using them at home. Those three main technologies are granulated activated carbon, which kind of absorbs PFAS like a sponge in these little pores. Reverse osmosis, which really creates a barrier between contaminants and clean water. And another type is ion exchange, and that is used in Colorado because it is very, very water saving in terms of like reverse osmosis consumes a ton of water. And as we all know, in the US West, we need to conserve actual quantities of water as well. So there's a photo of that system. And although these technologies do remove PFAS, they don't destroy them. So in a way, they make the chemicals someone else's forever problem. And then, unless, I mean, there could be a magical solution on the horizon. Well, not exactly. But scientists in labs around the world are now innovating techniques for degrading PFAS, and some of their methods are market ready. Essentially, they are breaking the unbreakable. And there's three main types, none of which I will really get into, but electrochemical oxidation, low temperature plasma treatment, and sonolysis. And this is essentially my last slide, but there is one tool that has already been operating at scale, pilot scale, but still semi-commercial, and that's called the PFAS Annihilator Reactor by the Battelle Memorial Institute. In which a reaction occurs in supercritical water under immensely high temperature and pressure so that gases that don't dissolve in water now can, creating a super solvent fluid that is expandable and compressible, and reactions can occur with fewer limits. And oxidants are able, under these conditions, to catalyze the breakdown of that formidable carbon-fluorine bond. And what's left is PFAS-free water, carbon dioxide, and inert salts. And the goal is to really bring the filter, the PFAS and concentrate, like from a granular activated carbon filter. And if that occurs, then a reactor is able to treat the equivalent of about 500,000 gallons of effluent daily. And I want to end on a quote from the CEO of Revive Environmental, which really points to just how strong and formidable that carbon-fluorine bond is. What he says is, this is like The Rock and John Cena holding hands, and you're trying to break that. So that is Poisoning the Well. That is my email below and my co-author's email. I realize we only have like a few minutes, but happy to take any quick questions, or you can email me questions.
Thank you so much, Sharon. It was amazing. It was
Thank you.
amazing. Thank you. Thank you. Really, thank you for all the great work you did and the
Thank you.
wonderful book. I honestly could not imagine that this book is so comprehensive, nice, and document based, and so thorough, and all the things you did across the US. That's wonderful piece of
Thank you.
a great work in environmental health and environmental science. I appreciate that. So we have, I think, a few questions or comments, I believe.
I
So
see that someone said they worked in one of the labs.
yeah, I saw that too. So guys, if you have any question, we have a little bit time for your questions. Okay, how can I access the recording of the meeting? The webinar has been recorded, so please send me an email later on and I will share with you because I don't know exactly. I cannot reach to every person everywhere, probably with my own classes or the people I know. I send them announcement. I do it myself, but if you don't hear from me within the next few days, please send me an email and I will be happy to share the recorded video with you, definitely. And I share already my email on the chat box, so please scroll up, you'll see my email. Send me just an email. Okay, perfect. Our IT expert says that we will post it on our CSUSB YouTube channel. Wonderful. Thank you, then. I appreciate that. Great help. That will be wonderful. Okay. Do you know why the mountain area running the springs, Lake Arrowhead, and the other neighborhoods up the mountain, San Bernardino Mountains, has such high levels, or should I look into that on my own time?
I would say look into it because I mean I'm not that familiar with the local area. I was just looking at maps myself. But the Environmental Working Group's tap water database and their PFAS concentration maps. These are two resources that the Environmental Working Group puts out. Um, they basically kind of amass all the data available from like public utilities. It's not their data, but they kind of put it in this user-friendly format. So then you can see where the sources are and where the contaminated places are. So I would take a look at those if I were you, and it might be more obvious to you than it is to me since I don't know the region that well myself.
And Sharon, correct me, please, if I'm wrong. I believe most of the cases of PFAS contamination in environment either coming from some type of government activity in the past, like military or different
Yeah.
tests of different materials they release in the environment, and or former bases. Some of those bases do
Yeah.
not exist anymore, but the contamination is there.
Yeah.
And some of them released by different types of industry, I believe, right?
Yeah.
That's the two major.
Yeah, and it seems like in your county it's more military than in the industrial, but I'm sure there is also some industrial. And in other parts of California, there is also the sludge contamination that in the really highly agricultural areas, some of that happened in the past as well. So
Excellent. Excellent. Okay. I Okay, I think I read everything in a chat box. If there is anything that somehow overlooked, you can speak or you can put in a chat box again before we leave, or if you want to say anything else.
well, I see that the person who wrote that is now worried. But there are if you find out that your home water is contaminated, you can get an under sink reverse osmosis filter that for not too expensive. Whole house filtration systems are will run in the thousands, but like a just kitchen under sink reverse osmosis filter will be a couple $100 probably. So something to
Thank you.
consider.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll try in future to invite you in person to the campus and arrange a better meeting, Sharon. I don't know when it happens, but I will be in touch with you. And
Sounds
once
good.
again, thank you so much for your time and for such a great work and great book. That
Thanks.
was so interesting to me, and I'm sure for all the attendees here, many of them in environmental science or environmental health, which is of particular interest to all of them. And we wish that we have you again
Thank
maybe
you.
next time in person, and I do my best to make it happen. I have to talk
Great.
to a lot of other people and see, yeah, find a way to do it. We will be in touch. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you
And
for having me,
it was
everyone.
great. It was
Thanks.
great. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Bye.
Everyone, thank you so much for being with us today. As I said, and as our IT expert said, we will post it, the video, the recorded video on the CSUSB YouTube channel. And if you reach out to me also, I can share it with you later on. Thank you again. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful time. Bye-bye.